One is shared goals. So we talked about the team needs to be aligned around a focus metric, a shared outcome, right? Like divergent goals don't help anybody have it.
Most initiatives, in my opinion, should be driven bottoms up. But the question, I think, is how do you set the appropriate guardrails or intentions, focus, outcome as a leader to make sure that those bottoms up initiatives are ultimately sort of achieving what the strategic goal of the company is.
This time, I had a chat with two fantastic leaders from SurveyMonkey. Brett, currently head of growth, and Erica, who was a VP of design and research and recently started a new role at Intuit. Both Erica and Brett spent more than 7 years in the company, and we explored the evolution of growth at SurveyMonkey over these years and discussed significant chapters in the company growth journey, including their legendary transition to the product-led growth model. My favorite part of the conversation was when Brad and Erica shared their expectations on ideal partnerships towards each other and how to build and maintain that partnership at a huge scale over years. If you find this show valuable, please share it with one of your colleagues or friends. It gives huge support to continue creating it. To receive all episodes right in your inbox, subscribe to katesuma.substack.com. With that, let's dive in after a short announcement. This episode is brought to you by Appcues, the platform that helps you design, deploy, and test captivating onboarding experiences in minutes, not weeks. Appcues created the Product Adoption Academy, which includes courses, templates, and examples to help you level up your product adoption, and you can use it entirely for free. Check out the 5-step growth flow review template, which I created to help companies connect growth hypotheses with behavioral patterns to uncover meaningful improvements. Find an example of Dropbox onboarding inside and use this template to review any growth flows in your product. Get the template through the link appcues.com/growthmates. Hello, Erica. Hello, Brett. Welcome to Growthmates. I'm so happy to have you both here today. How are you doing?
Excited to be here. Thanks for having us.
Very excited. Thanks for the invitation.
Wonderful. This is actually the first time when I have two guests simultaneously on the podcast, which hopefully will make the insights and the conversation 2 times more valuable for our audience. And Erica, you've been working at SurveyMonkey, I think, for almost 7 years, right? And Brett, you're in the company for 8.5 years. And you were able to also learn and observe Elena Verda as she built the growth function at SurveyMonkey. So both of you grew to become leaders today, which is exciting. And I'd like to start, if you could share, what was the most essential factor that kept you growing and being so dedicated to SurveyMonkey for such a long time? Maybe, Erica, we can start with you.
Yes. Thanks for calling that out. I will say SurveyMonkey is a company where you see a ton of really impressive tenures. I think Brad and I work daily with folks who have eclipsed us with 10 plus years. But for me, kind of what kept me learning and growing at the company, it's really a trifecta. I think the first is I've always been kind of stretched. I've always felt like I've had opportunities to learn and grow and do bigger, different things. So that's kind of one. Second is it's always been very interesting work and work that I'm really proud of. I think one of the things that I'm most proud of is the team, the research and design team that I built at SurveyMonkey. And then the last thing I'd say is great people and culture. Our culture has, of course, changed over the 7 years that I've been here, but it's a great place to work. I've had a baby. I lived through a global pandemic and lots of, multiple acquisitions. Life inevitably throws lots of challenges at you. And I think SurveyMonkey's been a great place to go through those.
Wonderful. It sounds like a company supported you along this way. So this is a great place to work, probably. Brad, what's your take on it?
Yeah, funny, similar first point and maybe a different second one, but I think for my entire tenure here, we've really had a very strong emphasis on culture and career growth. I think what that means for me is similarly regular intervals get new challenges, and we're rewarded and recognized accordingly, which is super important, I think, for me, especially early in my career. And I think the culture was something that was instilled very heavily by our late CEO, Dave Goldberg. And I think that has continued to be sort of a through line even after his departure and passing, and then through the new, organizational changes. So that's certainly something that's been keeping me around for this time. But I think secondly, and maybe more relevant to your listeners in this group, is we enjoy the benefits of scale. As a growth product manager, as a member of a development team, the ability to iterate, learn, ship, and to do that within weeks, days, months, super interesting for me because those cycles are very short and we can move pretty quickly. So I think scale has also been a helpful ingredient in being able to operate quickly and learn and win.
Absolutely. I can resonate to that, having my experience of working at Mira for more than 6 years. Reflecting on that, it feels like you've been working in several companies, different companies over that period of time. And I think because we have both of you today on this conversation, I'd like to dedicate this to discuss the SurveyMonkey growth evolution and walk through different chapters of company growth and changes that you can share with us. So maybe looking back, what were most significant 2-3 company growth chapters that you would identify, and what were some of the successful pivotal moments for the SurveyMonkey product-led growth motion?
Yeah, so looking at, I think, successful pivotal moments, stepping back in the time machine, going back 8-9 years, it's interesting to do this exercise every once in a while, but really where that started for us was heavy focus on optimizing our SurveyMonkey end page. The end page for SurveyMonkey is what we refer to as sort of the page that you see when you finish taking a survey and we say, hey, thanks for your submission, and don't you want to sign up and create more surveys? So a lot of the focus of growth teams at that time was, what's the right message? What's the right display? How do you get people to sign up at the highest rate possible? And then ultimately sort of engage. And that was, I think, one of our key viral loops and over the decades has been sort of the primary billboard that we have to drive brand awareness for us. You also saw us over that time doing some homepage optimizations as well. So that would be, the page you visit when you type surveymonkey.com in your browser. I think maybe more like growth marketing tactics. So those 2 pages, homepage, end page, I think if I had to, maybe 8 and 10 experiments at that time were on those sort of high traffic, high volume properties. And the tech stack was remarkably different too. I mean, going back to that time, we were using SiteSpect for A/B testing and, teams of data analysts to crunch those numbers together. And we've certainly come a long way from that. So that was sort of our first iteration. I think the second iteration for us, and, huge kudos to Elena Verna. I consider her a mentor of mine, certainly, and use a lot of her tactics and try to continue to maintain her systems today. But she, I think, did a good job transitioning into more growth monetization, growth engagement, and real true sort of product-led growth. And specifically what that would be are, focusing on our trial experiences. We have this moniker, try before you buy. So how do you allow people to try these features out before they purchase, maybe before they send that survey, to sort of prove the value instead of tell you that it's valuable? But that also transitioned into optimizations on our pricing pages, pricing and currency testing, which plans we offer, the conversion and upgrade flows themselves. That was sort of the second phase that we went into, which was growing a little bit outside of these growth marketing pages or surface areas and more sort of into the product and then monetization and engagement. And the tech stack changed a little bit too. So that was sort of the period where you saw us transition into our own internal growth experimentation platform. It was something that was built in-house. And that's sort of how we split and gate traffic and also do sort of feature rollouts. But we also automated our metrics reporting within that platform too. So you get a bunch of out of the box, conversion, engagement, customer support cases. So that, I think, took a lot of the time cycle away and allowed us to really focus on launching rather than analyzing, because we had a lot of that out of the box. And I think the third, which is kind of where we are now, which is, hey, it's not just the growth team that runs experiments here. Really, every team is a growth team, right? We all own a part of the user experience. We're all responsible for growing and driving in the metrics. So how do we enable all of our product development teams to operate within these experimentation frameworks? And how does the tech stack enable that? So we're still using our own internal experimentation platform for sort of traffic routing. But this is when you see the introduction of Amplitude, Epo, lots of new awesome tools. Amplitude's not new, but lots of great tools on the market that allow us to be a little more rigorous in how we're analyzing data and also democratizing that across the company.
Wow, I'm so happy to hear that at this point, every team is growth team. It's exactly the mission of this podcast, of everything I'm trying to create, is to enable this thinking across more cross-functional teams. It sounds like the first chapter was focused on these foundations, like you were building these viral loops to attract more top of the funnel. Then you could think better about your POG model pricing, and then you started scaling this growth motion throughout the organization so other teams start shifting that. And thinking of the scale of the company on each phase, especially on the second one, when you introduced your own experimentation framework, what was the scale of the company on each stage? So, for example, for our listeners to understand when it's even realistic to start building your experimentation platform, when it's realistic to start imagining that every team is a growth team.
Well, you definitely have to hit that scale threshold. So, on a weekly basis, we see hundreds of thousands of new account registrations come to our website and enter our doors for the first time. So you're going to need to be on the order of tens of thousands for a given metric to be able to run sort of split tests. So that would be my barometer there, is maybe signups or new free registrations as the example. You're going to need to be in the tens of thousands, sort of hundreds of thousands mark. I think, now we are certainly into that hundreds of thousands range, but you're going to need to see at least tens of thousands of folks doing a certain activity for you to really be confident and also get those learnings quickly, in the space of weeks, sort of thing.
Absolutely. One of the most frequently asked questions that I receive is when it makes sense to start introducing product-led growth model. I don't think we will have an answer to that question. It's like very difficult question to answer. At the same time, I know that you guys experimented with both like sales-led motion, growth, product-led motion. And I'm wondering how was it? What was the transformative moment that changed your strategy? What did you learn from this? Was it successful or not? Yeah. Tell us more.
Great question, Kate. I think our roots are certainly product-led growth. And, I think of all the folks, we're probably one of the oldest to be doing this over this. So it's been really decades, I'd say, since we've sort of had a product-led growth motion where the product is responsible for doing the acquiring, converting, engaging, retaining. You saw us, though, a few years ago, try to enter into new markets, specifically in the market research space. There were a couple reasons for doing that. It was an untapped market for us. And for those who maybe aren't familiar with market research, that would be, running studies like concept testing or new market sizing studies, or maybe like price optimization, feature optimization, new products, new advertisements. That research is incredibly important for really any company across any industry. So that was a new market for us that we didn't have a huge presence in. Now, we did have products, particularly SurveyMonkey Audience, that was an acquisition for us and is still a robust business for us, which is connecting survey creators to a global network of survey takers. And that was, and still is, a self-service business. But what we were finding is that there were many, many companies that were looking for a higher level of service. So maybe another use case would be something like brand tracking, right? Is my brand awareness growing or shrinking over time? And those types of use cases are really dominated by some older names in the market. Maybe an example of that would be a Nielsen or a Kantar. And these are, very expensive, very slow moving, very heavy consultative or consulting sort of approach there. That was one that we wanted to disrupt. And we thought that our software enabled approach would be able to bring those insights faster and also at a lower cost. I think now the challenge was these were customers that were familiar with our brand, but weren't necessarily users or familiar with our products. So that was one where product-led growth, they were already on our platform. So we needed to go out and drive awareness. And so this was our big attempt to move up market And really what that required for us was to spin up new inbound, outbound motions. So things like events, webinars, right? Conferences. You need to have presence, especially for buyers who are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on some of these contracts, which for us is very large compared to that sort of individual user paying for a subscription. So I think the reason why I'm saying that is this was all in a period where revenue was king, right? Think back 2, 3, 4 years ago, revenue growth. That was the North Star for a lot of folks. And you saw that it was, very heavy, pretty expensive outbound motions. I mean, super aggressive pipeline goals to hit those growth targets, which meant that sales development reps, business development reps, even account executives themselves had pipeline goals as well as actual sort of closed deals that they would need to go after. And that it was effective from a revenue growth perspective, but not so much from the profitability, because you can imagine it usually takes a large sales force of humans to not only secure those new deals, but also to maintain them and make sure folks were happy, engaged, activated, and renewing, right? So that I think was an interesting learning for us because the profitability profile wasn't necessarily there, even though it was successful from a revenue growth perspective.
Wow. Yeah. And then as far as I remember, you made this, not a pivot, but a shift back to the product-led growth motion that was there originally. So how was that, maybe in a nutshell, getting back to the roots?
We're still smack dab in the middle of it. I mean, and I think you're right, Ken. It's not something that necessarily went away. It's just a refocus and reinvestment into that. And, you can imagine reallocation of resources from, very heavyweight sort of go-to-market outbound activities back into more R&D investment. So as a result of that, you see we're feeling some of the pain, right? It's a big focus on metrics, event tracking, event configuration. I think there are certainly areas of our site that are not as well configured as they could be. And so there's some more work for us to do to sort of set that new baseline. But I think ultimately as sort of our DNA and in our internal systems, it's something that never really left the company, is just a refocus or reinvestment.
You are in good hands to continue moving with this direction. And as you've mentioned, like shifting back the force into the R&D, maybe Erica, you could tell us more about that as you represent the design and research function. If you can tell us how design and research functions have been involved into different strategic moments of the company and how this function that you're leading influenced growth strategy in SurveyMonkey. And I'm asking it because, to be honest, my observation in general across the market that the product strategy is in hands of product function, and design has certain influence towards that, or research, but not necessarily a very direct influence. And I'm very interested in gathering more examples from the companies like SurveyMonkey, how you push your influence towards the company strategy. Yeah,
it's a great question. I'll talk a little bit about how our design and research function has evolved, but also I think that a side note on influence is I think a lot about this topic as a executive and design leader. It's something that I think a lot about, and I think that influence happens in a context, right? And so some of the things that you've heard now from Brad is you've heard about strategic shifts in the business, which are also in line with like macro context, right? Like we've been, in the 7, 8 years that Brad and I have been working in this business, we've been through a number of macroeconomic cycles as well. And so I think about influence as like sort of taking in the context and evolving what you're doing, what your activities are, what your strategy is in the context of how your customers are evolving, how the economy is evolving, how the business is evolving. And so I think you can't look at them in isolation. I think if you look at sort of the evolution of the research function. So when I started 7 years ago, we had one user researcher and pretty traditional qualitative user research. We were sort of reacting. We would occasionally kind of work with the growth team to test in parallel, like, oh, hey, we got these metrics. We're trying to understand the why. But there was no way to keep up and run qualitative research at the pace that the growth experiments were running. And certainly no way to get research into the head end of the process, which I think is where I've seen research be most strategic. And so over time, we built out a mixed methods research team. So we have quantitative product research skills along with qualitative, and we actually bring that together with our marketer market insights and customer insights functions as well. So this lets us do like larger scale quantitative research, things like feature prioritization or pricing studies that help us kind of be a little bit more at the head end of the process and sort of fuel those ideas that are coming into the roadmap or the backlog. Likewise, we're doing more foundational, sort of longer scale qualitative research as well, diary studies, persona development, et cetera. So that's sort of one piece, is sort of how the research team has evolved their skill set and ability to sort of plug into the process earlier. The other is actually, and this is both true of our DNA and also a core value of our product, is about democratizing access to research at scale. And so we focus the team on, there's sort of a research operations component of the team, which is focused on giving access to research at scale. So things like user testing accounts, so that we can run quick feedback on a live experiment, training so that PMs and designers can run their own experiments, access to past data, are all things that are sort of democratizing access to that research. And then we've also recently integrated our customer advocacy team, who was part of the customer operations org before. And they're really focused on surfacing insights from several different channels, especially the support channel. So feedback that's coming in through our support queues, but also our in-product feedback and our NPS. So we're getting sort of a more well-rounded view of research, not just sort of chasing growth experiments with research studies. So that's on the research side. And then I think on the design side, so my org, for fun, we are called RAD, Research and Design. We have a cool, logo, which I can't show you here, but, so it's kind of fun. But, in terms of seeing designers play a role in kind of defining hypotheses or helping influence that backlog, I think one of the things that we've done is we've embedded growth designers. And actually across all of our product teams, we kind of work in this, we call it 3 in a box. I'm not in love with the term 3 in a box, but I haven't thought of, there's like the 3-legged stool, or there's different, I don't know. Anyway, maybe one of your listeners has a better term for this, but this idea that product development is a team sport, that a product manager, designer, engineer have a core set of ownership. There's other functions involved as well, of course, content and research and BI and QA, but this sort of core group of folks that are assigned to a work stream, they have a shared mission, they have a goal to drive and are focused on that outcome. That enables the team to contribute to a shared backlog. We embrace this idea that ideas can come from anywhere. That doesn't mean every idea that a designer comes up with, we ship, right? Just to be clear, one of the things I see, designers are the most successful contributing ideas when they're really close to the data, when they're really immersed in understanding how the business works, but also bring divergent thinking to that so that they can come up with new ideas, but new ideas that also are credible. We've also seen the content design function, which reports to me as well, has been really successful at bringing forth ideas for some simple copy changes that will make a huge difference in streamlining a flow or helping users understand what's going on there. So, I think these 3 in a box teams with access to a more diverse set of data and research have enabled us to get more of that shared thinking. That being said, of course, it's not perfect. Nothing's perfect, but those are some of the things that we've done.
Wonderful. And I love that you have your umbrella is covering research, design, and content design. So basically, this is a good combination to operate with and to understand how these 3 sub-functions of design should fit into the growth domain. And what I noticed based on my experience, that with content and product design, it's very understandable. The expectations, the process, and the influence of these 2 functions is understandable because you can come up with like low-hanging fruits or big ideas that will influence the metric directly. Especially content is such a powerful thing for growth product design. However, the user research is a bit more difficult because in order to inform the growth strategy or even growth experimentation, you need to be from one side at a base of the team who is running these experiments. However, you need to run very good in-depth research like diary studies that takes a lot of time, a lot of preparation. And it's a bit of also mental model conflict for this person, for this user researcher in these growth teams, how I provide these insights for the teams at this space And at the same time, I go in depth with my research. I do these diary studies that take several months. I couldn't find the solution to that, to be honest. Erica, do you have any opinion on that or tactics that maybe help to embed the user researchers into growth successfully?
It's a great question. I have maybe a somewhat orthogonal point of view, which is that I don't know that embedding research into growth is the answer. And I'll tell you why. Because when you talk about embedding a functional representative in a team, then the assumption is that that person is sort of doing it end to end, right? Like they're doing all the research. And I think what you're describing is a challenge that you see particularly with a more traditional qualitative user researcher who's focused on, validation type of research or like post-design research. And actually, I don't think that type of research has the biggest leverage in growth, because any qualitative user interview that you do with 7 customers or usability tests is not going to trump the quantitative learnings that you're going to get. So I think actually it's less about thinking about how do you do traditional qualitative user research methods on growth experiment. But I think about because that's sort of in the middle of the process, right? And I think about the head end and the tail end. So the head end is this more foundational research where you're not in a growth cycle, right? You are doing foundational research, feature prioritization, looking at customers in product feedback surveys, look to mine data, looking at your NPS, and using the triangulation of those insights to feed a backlog, right? Like it's more in the idea generation than in the idea validation. So that's one place. And I don't think you embed to do that, right? Because you need quant, you need qual, you need customer research, you need market research, you need brand research, right? So I think it's too many specializations to say there's one person who's responsible. That's the head end of the process. And then the tail end is also really important. And again, product development is cyclical, so there's no end, right? But this, we see this all the time. Okay. We've run an experiment. We got fantastic results. We're going to launch it, right? Okay, great. Everybody's super excited. This is amazing. We launch it and it's not really working the way we thought it was going to work. Why isn't it working the way we thought it was going to work? Or what do we do next, right? What's the next build from that, right? And that's where user research, again, is really important to interrogate that why. You're not going to get that fast enough to make a decision about if it was a winning test. But if you want that winning test to ladder up to the next test and the next test and the next test, you need to understand that through line. So I see research kind of coming in that interrogation as well. So I guess it's not right there in the middle where you're running user research tests on growth experiments. It's everywhere else.
I would agree with that, Erica. It's more maybe sort of building that pipeline, and that means you need to get started now so that you can start to use it tomorrow. And I think maybe to supplement that a little bit is growth product teams specifically are very metrics oriented. And look, we have to be, right? That's sort of how business value communicates itself, but to be able to give your teams the space and also the insights for how we're driving customer value, these things are not mutually exclusive, right? Our job is to sort of find that intersection there. So I think having that pipeline can be a very helpful idea generator, or maybe less specific ideas, or maybe more sort of broad themes. And then we can always map those to metrics, right? And then choose those to sort of prioritize and focus. So I would agree that it's more a pipeline rather than sort of at each step in the experimentation process.
I think I will have to record something like a separate episode on how research teams collaborate with growth teams and what are the options like embedded, cross-functional, company-wide research teams. I think in different scale, it's also different situation. By the way, talking about that, we are halfway. We have some time left, and I really want to talk to you both, as we have both product and design leaders here, about the product and design collaboration, because currently SurveyMonkey is scaled organization, more than 1,000 people. However, you've seen its transformation over different chapters, and I've been at Mira from 50 employers to almost 2,000 people. And over time, the thing that I observed that product and design alignment becomes more challenging with that scale. And the exercise that I prepared for you today is to do this sort of lightning round, but with each of you to uncover what are the challenges in partnerships, and what is the ideal partnership for both of you from your perspective? And I think we can start from Brad, and we can start thinking of your ideal partnerships or your challenges with design function as you represent the product function. So let's start maybe with more meaty part and challenges. What kind of challenges do you see in partnership with design function?
Well, I'm a natural pessimist, so I have no shortage of challenges, but that I think is probably typical in product development. I think, so a dysfunctional team to me is a team where one single function sort of dictates what the agenda or the backlog is going to be, either, product, design, engineering, marketing, you could name it, but you need to have that shared representation and shared ownership and accountability within those teams. So we find ourselves in some odd scenarios when one group is calling the shots, right? It's that sort of collaborative discussion with what's feasible, what we actually think we believe will move a metric, and what actually sort of applies and adds value to the user. And it's that sort of prioritization matrix there that would determine the next thing that we do. And it's very hard to do that in a vacuum without having each one of those inputs and considering it. So the way I like to sort of communicate this with my groups and with my teams is we operate with a shared backlog, right? Like everyone is encouraged to add items, and product leads specifically too, because we're primarily responsible for setting priority and also determining sort of sprint scope. But I think it's very helpful to sort of pause, ask the group, what's missing? What are we not thinking of? What else should be going into this sprint that we're maybe not considering? And allowing people to have the voice and the freedom to create a ticket, put it in there, talk about it, bring it up during sprint grooming sessions, right? Just welcome and encourage that level of participation and engagement from the team, because frankly, we're all users of software products, and I love SurveyMonkey and we do a lot of things well, but it's not so specific and so deep in terms of subject matter expertise that we don't have sort of valid ideas for how to make this more simple, more easy to use, right? So I tend to welcome disagreements, and I certainly welcome for folks across the team to highlight work that we think is missing and make sure that that's reflected and prioritized accordingly. So I think those are, some of the challenges is one team maybe sort of outweighing the other. On the ideal side is, having a partner that is someone that is willing and able to collaborate on, what those key themes and opportunities are. So typically, I think, focus metrics, sometimes they tend to be sort of set or, hey, it's maybe very obvious where, new subscribers coming in, new account registrations, retention rates, right? Those tend to be, I think, a little less controversial across the company in terms of what are we trying to drive. I think the hard part is, well, how do you drive it? Right. So that's where I really view this partnership as particularly important and impactful, is less so setting the metric, but more so what do we do about it? And what are the key themes or focus areas that we are investing in order to drive that metric? I think that's always the hard part and certainly the fun part. And where I think this partnership gets, super important and very dynamic.
Interesting. And I think you have more examples of how the ideal partnership can look like. And maybe you can share these examples on individual contributors level and on a team level, because I think you have this, zoom out perspective on teams, on individual contributors as a leader, and maybe it can be quite different.
Yeah, I'll give a couple. I think on the individual contributor or team level, so autonomy, super important for me, not only in just making sure the team's engaged and enjoying the scope of work, but also that's where the best ideas come from. Not everything can be top down. We don't have all the context, and we need to empower our teams to observe and, go after those solutions that I think make sense. And then one way that we have operationalized doing this for some teams in the past, and this example comes specifically from SurveyMonkey Audience, which again is that sort of global network of survey takers that you can come and ask questions and receive access to those, is once a sprint, we would do just a very simple, intentionally rough user empathy session with the smaller development groups. So that would be product manager, product designer, your tech lead, and also an open invitation to anybody else on the engineering, QA, content strategy team for that specific development group. So usually that would be a group of, 10, 12, 15 people, maybe max. And really there was no set agenda, right? There was an hour on the board each sprint. We come in, we would watch some user empathy sessions, just observe users either getting stuck or being successful in that particular area of the product. And we set a notepad and we would write down what we observed and then potential solutions that we would find as a result. And, this was very operationally lightweight for us and also got the whole team involved. And I think it cut down a lot of the communication cycles where instead of talking about Jira tickets and how do you prioritize these, it was just sort of a shared, everybody was able to feel the pain. Everybody was able to see the pain. And sometimes that's way better than cutting a Jira ticket, right? So I think those types of sessions allow us to see those observations in the wild. And specifically what would come out of that is like, hey, we want to reduce friction, for example, in this particular area of the product, which makes sense. It's great. But like, where are people getting stuck? What is the friction? And how do you be maybe a little more specific about that? And, through that, there was a whole theme of experimentation in terms of how do you match at the highest rate survey creators with the survey takers who they're looking for. And, there were a bunch of problems in there that we were able to sort of diagnose. And some of our best experiment ideas came out of that, while also empowering and engaging the team to sort of to work through those quickly. So I think that's more at the sort of individual level. And I really encourage our groups to have those conversations. I think higher level at the team level, that's where, Erica, your team comes in. We have customer advocacy groups within our research and design function. I love these folks because in a smaller company, this would be probably me or a product manager or my team sifting through NPS results, customer satisfaction. We've got lots of feedback channels, right? Some old sources, some new sources. So to be able to bring all that together, synthesize what we're hearing and, distill those into key insights. I think NPS is a good example. And I know NPS is kind of getting a bad rap sort of in the growth space. And does it correlate with revenue? Does it not? But at the very least, NPS is a helpful metric just to bucket people who are satisfied and dissatisfied and be able to hear like, what are the key drivers of that satisfaction or dissatisfaction and make sure that those are reflected in our development themes with a metric that supports it. And so I think those are sort of a couple ways at maybe the team level as well as the IC level that we can farm ideas and also articulate the key areas of focus that are actually driving a focus metric for us.
If I summarize that, it feels like if there is a disagreement in the room, we should keep user in the center of this room to figure out what we are actually doing here, who we are optimizing for. Because in my opinion, and from my observation, this friction between these functions appear most frequently when there is like very opinionated like culture, when everybody has their own opinion. However, it will always be like that. Everybody will have an opinion, but being user-focused helps in a way because you get back to this objective reality, what we are building, who is our user, what is actual problem that user has. And it helps in all these aspects that you've mentioned. All these sources help us align better, probably. And Erica, what is your take on it?
Kate, I agree with that, but I want to add a little bit of a provocative point on that, which of course, I haven't built my career in user-centered design.
This is why you are here.
Yeah. Of course, I believe that user is the center, but I think that the reality is that in the organizations that we work in, most of them are for-profit organizations, driving a business outcome. And, I think the source of friction that I see most often isn't different opinions or strong opinions. It's actually where the business outcome and the user outcome are not well aligned. Right. We've seen that, Brad and I talk about this all the time. One of the biggest impacts to our NPS going down is when we raise prices, right? We raise prices. It drives a positive business outcome in the short term because we're making more money, but users are mad. And then, you have the sort of endless debate about over the long term, does the cost of that, lower user sentiment, lower NPS actually negate the benefit that you got? But every business deals with that, right? So I think the secret sauce of growth teams and the places where the magic really happens is when those user needs and business needs are aligned, where a positive outcome for the user is a positive outcome for the business as well. So for example, when we're looking at things like deploy rate, right? In SurveyMonkey, we think, sending a survey. We don't call it sending. I won't get into the details of why that is yet. That's a different podcast. But deploy rate, right, is a metric that is both in line with user needs, right? A user's getting value out of their product if they're sending a survey and getting responses, as well as with business needs, because we know engagement, conversion, and retention and all those things that the business cares about. So I think that while, of course, the purist in me is like, let the user decide, put the user need at the center. Like, that's not the reality of the organizations that most of us are working in. And the reality is like, how are you finding that intersection where the business outcome and the user outcome are super well aligned?
Yeah, I love that you brought this, because this is the dilemma for growth. Product designers, product managers, constantly in our head, we are optimizing for both business and user, trying to find this match. Erica, do you have anything else from your side to add, thinking about ideal partnerships with a product function or challenges that you would like to raise? Yeah.
Yes. Well, of course, I like working with Brad. That's why I roped him into coming to do this podcast with me. I think about the role that leaders play in sort of alignment and driving kind of these 3-in-a-box development teams. I think that it's only possible to really drive alignment with strong relationships and clear communication. And I think that when leaders aren't aligned or they're not clearly and consistently communicating with their teams, the disconnects get amplified at every layer. So I think for me, like, one is it's super important to mirror this kind of 3-in-a-box structure and have the leadership model good practices for the team, which is why we spend a lot of time together. For me personally, as VP of Research and Design, my primary partners are heads of product and heads of engineering. However, part of what led us to this conversation is last year, while I was searching for a new design leader for the growth team, I had the opportunity to interim manage that team, which gave me a unique opportunity to kind of get closer to the growth designers and build that relationship with the product and engineering leaders within the growth space. And that was also a really great experience for me to get closer to those details and help me kind of set the new leader up for success and develop a new level of empathy and point of view on how the teams can work together more effectively across. So I think for leaders, it's really good to sort of operate at different altitudes to get different perspectives. And then I guess I would say on the IC or team level, I think we've talked a lot about the seat at the table, the metaphorical seat at the table, kind of how do you have that voice, that influence for the backlog? And of course, everything we said sounds wonderful and like, oh yeah, that's right. But I think that my kind of guidance, advice to designers out there who are really maybe finding themselves in the seat, but not occupying it as effectively as they'd like to, or trying to find that seat is, I think there's 3 kind of ingredients that I see to sort of having that voice. Like, one is shared goals. So we talked about the team needs to be aligned around a focus metric, a shared outcome, right? Like, divergent goals don't help anybody have it. Having shared goals, I think then it's building your credibility, right? Like, you want to know the data, you want to know the craft, you want to know the customer, right? Like, I think, bringing credible ideas to the table is an important component of that. But then I think the third piece is relationships, right? Actually building those relationships, that trust, that camaraderie, because not every idea that you do is going to be great for customers. Not every idea you come up with is going to be a winning idea. And so like building that trust and that rapport in that relationship. So those are sort of my like 3 ingredients for success in this kind of cross-functional team having influences: shared goals, credible perspective, and strong relationships.
Fantastic. So maybe last actionable question to both of you. We were talking about these relationships, how leadership can support that. Maybe each of you could share one example or a couple of examples of rituals that helped you in fostering these better relationships between product and design functions. So whoever wants to start.
I could take a stab. I think the thing that drives me the most, especially as an IC, but also now as a leader, is how do you foster autonomy within your individual teams, but still have guidance and control and predictability. And I think maybe you could otherwise call this, top down versus bottom up. And look, some initiatives are top down and you can't avoid it. And we need to rally the team to achieve a goal. And that makes perfect sense. But most initiatives, in my opinion, should be driven bottoms up. But the question, I think, is how do you set the appropriate guardrails or, intentions, focus, outcome as a leader to make sure that those bottoms up initiatives are ultimately sort of achieving what the strategic goal of the company is. And the ritual is quarterly planning. How do we do that? And I think this is probably a trigger word for many people. Who likes quarterly planning? I don't think I've ever seen anyone enjoy that, but I think a way that we can make it more enjoyable or less painful is to focus less so on delivery dates and more so on key outcomes. And I think I've seen us fall into this trap, and everyone's felt this before, where we make bizarre sacrifices trying to hit a date instead of delivering that pure customer value. And I understand it, right? Businesses, we want predictability. We have plans. We have go-to-market plans. It's going to affect a bunch of people, right? So you do need to be able to communicate timelines, but I would just encourage our groups, and I try to approach this with my teams as well, is focus just less so on the delivery dates and more so on what is the key outcome. And again, the reason is because typically, Kate, the only specific thing on a project is the deadline or the delivery date, or the problem and the solution. Those are both very ambiguous, right? So if the date is the only thing fixed and immovable, you start to sacrifice scope. You reduce scope, or you take a cheaper approach, maybe that's, more technically feasible, maybe not ultimately what people are looking for. We tend to make some of those sacrifices or compromises when the date is very specific and immovable. And also I'll add, look, we rarely get it right on our first attempt, right? It's usually that second, third, fourth iteration that's actually ultimately the one that works. So we also need to give our teams some space to build in some of that time for iteration, rather than, okay, great, we hit the date, we ship this thing, let's go ahead and move on to the next project that's behind schedule, right? So it's tough. I think the counterbalance to that is, when do you know when enough is enough and when you should move on? And usually that is, we've actually moved the metric and we see the results, or we've tried a bunch of times and kind of everything that we thought was going to work and it didn't. So is this the actual thing that we should go after? But that tends to be a ritual that takes a little bit of the stress off of very specific scope, very waterfall process. It must be this design on this date. And rather, hey, let's actually deliver a solution that ultimately drives the outcome that we're looking for, which takes the pressure off a little bit.
This is very interesting take. And I think it's not just a ritual, it's a culture. And over time, the team is getting used to that and getting off some pressure. Erica, do you have anything from your side you'd like to add before you have to jump off?
Yeah, I think the last thing I'd add is, I think for design, we're always really focused on how do we avoid shipping our org chart. So what do we need to do as a team to, glue the seams, or, there's lots of different phrases for that, across the experience. And so we have to have rituals and practices in place, such as our peer critiques and our design reviews and our shared design system, and practices for designing in the open, in Figma, in our Slack channels, to create visibility and also alignment across, because I do think design has to play this role, particularly in growth where you're working horizontally, in kind of being that glue across the experience. So that's another thing that I would add, that I think are some of the more design specific rituals.
Absolutely. I also remember the phrase I've mentioned a year ago, that collaboration is a design tool these days, especially for scaled companies. You spend sometimes more time on being this glue and sharing what you are doing with others than actually doing the design. But without that, there is no way to create great product outcomes at scale. There is just no way. And it's a bit of changing the mindset and making this collaboration enjoyable, our goals as leaders, to make this collaboration enjoyable. So designers will not be saying my job is actually to create beautiful design, and I'm not doing that because I'm just talking to others how to make that enjoyable. So probably the topic for another podcast.
You probably need some sort of tool like Miro to do that, right?
Exactly. All right. Thanks, Erica, for being here. I will ask Brad some lightning round questions for the end. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Well, great. Thank you so much for the opportunity. It was really fun to chat with you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Brad, if you don't mind, staying here a bit longer and answering some lightning round questions. So usually we ask about recommendations, different books, different resources that our listeners can dive in after this conversation. So what maybe kind of books you would recommend, or resources or links based on the topics that we've discussed today. Yeah.
Of course, you've probably heard me use some buzzwords or phrases from Marty Cagan himself. If anybody hasn't read, I would highly recommend Inspired, How to Create Tech Products Customer Love by Marty Cagan. It's not a new book. I think it's been around, but definitely suggested reading. And it's one that really changed my perspective on what is the role of a product team and just how do you approach product development? And I think, look, I won't spoil the book for anybody, but it talks about ways that you can nurture empowered product teams across the organization. He also talks about how intentionally ugly prototypes or concepts can allow you to sort of divorce yourself from this emotional attachment from a solution that you spent so much time building, and it gives you some space to fail more quickly. And also just the role and operations of product discovery. Just how do you do it? I would certainly recommend that book or Marty Cagan's materials for anybody who hasn't already checked that out. And then one that I'm actually sort of currently working through and thinking about how do we operationalize this across our group too is a book, Continuous Discovery Habits by Teresa Torres. Similarly, I think she talks about very focused on empowered autonomous product teams, but how do you operationalize that a little more tactically? Things like opportunity trees. So, hey, I'm not an expert on that material yet, but it's one that I am wondering how we might implement and operationalize more across the organization.
Wonderful. I love that you've mentioned Marty Cagan, and I also recommend Empowered as another book, especially about teams. And I know that he's actually writing or in process of writing another book. And
oh man, I got to get on the pre-order list for that one. That's great.
Yeah, exactly. And there is a way actually already to do that. Maybe we will put these links and, promote these resources. So yeah, I've noticed that Erica also put some notes about UX Collective community. I also +1 to that. I've been contributing to that community and wrote a couple of articles on their newsletter. And Move Fast and Fix Things, I have never heard about that. We will put these links as well, so our audience can get some inspiration from new books, new newsletters, and our old ones from Marty Cagan. All right. Thank you so much, Brett, for being today here with Erica. It's been a very insightful conversation. I think we should bring more product leaders, not just design leaders, to this podcast, because it feels like we are speaking the same language,
Well, thanks so much for having us, Kate. I had a really, really great time. Thanks again.
Wonderful. Cheers. Thank you for listening. If you found it valuable, you can support Growthmates by sharing this episode with your friends and colleagues. Subscribe to our show on your favorite platforms and get all episodes to your inbox by subscribing to katesuma.substack.com. Let's keep growing together.